Hi everybody, welcome to week 9. It is 1 week from spring break. We'll wrap up this week and then you guys will be off for your break. I'm sure you're looking forward to that. I know I am, even though I don't have any big spring break plans. It'll be nice just to have a little breather. So this week is pretty interesting as far as I'm concerned, the topics that we're covering anyway, because we have the Lincoln-Douglas debates and John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. So these are two key moments in antebellum America. Our objectives this week, the things that I want you to focus on, are the Lincoln-Douglas debates, of course. Pay attention to how those really are a microcosm of the issues the nation is facing. What have we been talking about for the last 8 weeks? Things like Kansas, Nebraska, the Austin Manifesto, the Lecompton Constitution. Last week it was Dred Scott. And of course slavery. So these arguments really come down to these two men, Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas, arguing out what these issues mean to America, most critically the issue of slavery. We're going to talk about Harper's Ferry, very well-known incident. I'm sure everybody in this class is familiar with John Brown and his raid on Harper's Ferry. It is a iconic moment, and there's some iconic imagery that comes out of John Brown's raid. So we'll get to review that and think about what that raid meant for the nation. And then finally, as we finish up Soul by Soul this week, Johnson, he points out that his book covers this the slave market, Louisiana or New Orleans slave markets to be more precise. But how do we end up there? Well, Johnson points out that this internal slave trade that has driven slavery south and then west from the upper south, from Virginia, Maryland, from those tobacco plantations into the deep south of Alabama, Mississippi, and then into the west of Texas. And now here we are arguing over Kansas and Nebraska. Why did that internal slave trade force the issue of slavery in the years leading up to the Civil War? So give that some thought as we go on. First, let me talk about Potter and the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Here we are. What is it all about? Well, there's an open Senate seat in Illinois in 1858. Abraham Lincoln, who has been out of politics for quite a while, he's upset by what he sees happening around the nation, and most recently what he saw happen with the Dred Scott decision that we talked about last week. So he thinks, I'm going to get back into the game. I'm going to run for this Illinois Senate seat because I'm fed up. I've had it up to here with what I am seeing happen in America. He runs against the Democrat. Lincoln's going to run as Republican. He runs against the Democrat Stephen Douglas, who we know very well by this point. And he gets Douglas to agree to a series of debates throughout the state of Illinois. Ultimately, they agree on 7 debate sites. I've included a link in the module this week. You can actually look at some background on each of those sites as well as the whole debate if you like. Historians have typically focused on what's known as the Freeport question, a question that Lincoln asks of Douglas, basically saying, can the people of a territory lawfully exclude slavery before they become a state? And this is supposed to back Douglas into a corner, because if Douglas says yes they can, he denies the Dred Scott decision of the Supreme Court, right? Because the Supreme Court has just said that can't happen, that that slavery cannot be excluded. So Congress can't exclude it through a territorial constitution. And if he says no, well, then he denies his own idea that he came up with, right, of popular sovereignty. I don't want to focus on that. Potter doesn't focus on that, and we shouldn't, because that question, that's kind of a smokescreen to some other issues that are happening during the debates. Douglas had answered that. It had been, he'd come out with his solution to that problem, right, which was essentially that, well, hey, people of a territory, if they don't want slavery, they can just ignore the Supreme Court. In a nutshell, that's what he says. Regardless of whether or not we agree with that, that's what he does. So the key argument that's happening during the Lincoln-Douglas debates is the argument over slavery, folks. It comes down to that. What? I know, shocker, right? That this is where we're at. And Lincoln makes his famous House Divided speech, makes the argument that, hey, as a nation, we cannot survive divided, half free and half slave. Can't do it. Douglas disagrees. Douglas is like, of course we can. We've done it for 100 plus years, or not quite now, but we've done it for nearly 100 years. How's that? I'll say it that way. We have been a nation with slave states and free states, so we can do it. And that's the crux of these debates, right? Douglas basically does not think that the slave issue or the issue of blacks, period, should be that important. He's like, if a state wants to have slavery, let them have it, and let's get on with our lives, right? This is not a big enough issue for Stephen Douglas to risk the Union. Abraham Lincoln, on the other hand, he thinks it is wrong. He thinks slavery is a moral wrong. It's a political wrong. It is an economic wrong. And he believes that the nation is going to fall apart. His problem is, how does he save the Union? All right? He wants to end slavery. How does he save the Union, which is also very important to him? He does not give. He does not have a plan to free slaves and give former slaves or free blacks any kind of rights. Let's clear that up right now. Not that Lincoln was a proponent of slavery, but he was also not a proponent of equality. Very important to remember. We like to, we have idolized and canonized Abraham Lincoln. You know, that he's the great emancipator. Yes, he emancipated the slaves, but we have to understand the context and environment in which he did that. So he proposes that, slavery should end, but he is a typical man of mid-19th century American culture. He is a white man that does not believe that blacks have the right to necessarily own property, vote, sue in court, all these things that we've talked about over the semester, right? He doesn't believe they necessarily have the right to do that, but what he does believe is that they are human beings and they have rights, the right not to be owned by other human beings. So that's the difference between Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas in their debates, and they argue that out. And I've got a video in the module this week that where you hear Lincoln's argument in a reenactment, and it's a short video, so hopefully you'll kind of get the gist of his argument there. In the end, the election is held for the Senate seat, and wait for it, yes, Douglas wins. The great Abraham Lincoln does not win. And why? Well, the state legislators went largely Democrat. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but mainly the Democrats win new seats or hold their congressional seats in the Illinois election. They pick the senators. At this time, there is no direct election of senators like we have today. State representatives picked the two senators from that state. It's the votes go the majority Democrats, so they pick Stephen Douglas. That's not going to change until the 17th Amendment in 1913. So Douglas wins, and we're like, what? The great Abraham Lincoln lost? Yes, he did. But what did this do? It is 1858, folks. It is 2 years from the presidential election of 1860, and Abraham Lincoln puts up a good fight. And he gets some recognition, he gets some juice, I guess. I don't know if that's even a contemporary term, right? But he gets noticed. And people say, hey, this guy, this Abraham Lincoln, he would be a good anti-slavery leader for the Republican Party. So his star is really on the horizon here. And when 1860 rolls around, the presidential election, a lot of people are going to look to Abraham Lincoln for a solution. All right, that's the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Again, there's a video for you to watch. You browse through the website that I linked in the module. I don't expect you to read every debate, even though you certainly can. It will take you a while. But browse through and hear what these guys are arguing. Pay particular attention to the argument over slavery. Okay, so in 1858, Lincoln and Douglas are arguing out the philosophical or the political issues, the economic issues of slavery, right? They're talking about it from debate to debate to debate. What are they not doing? Acting, right? They're politicians. They're trying to win a political position. So they're arguing about it. They're talking about it. There's a discussion, but there's no action. Oh, John Brown, remember him? Of course you do. He's the cold-blooded, murdering, anti-slavery zealot of the Potawatomi Massacre. He's back in 1859. He has gone east, back to the east, and he realizes that things have kind of played out for him in Kansas. And really, people recognize that the Potawatomi Massacre was just that. And, he's not necessarily welcomed. He's not being hunted by the law, right? Not to that extent, but people realize that maybe he has gone too far and he has not handled his desire to end slavery in the proper manner. So he heads back east. He's got a new plan. His plan is basically to arm slaves in the east, in Virginia in this case, arm them, get them to rise up and escape, he says, or throw off their bonds, right? And basically he wants to incite an uprising, a rebellion. He does that. He moves back east and he gains some support, right? He goes around basically trying to raise money to build an army or build what he thinks is necessary to get this uprising going. We can talk about it all day long. He gets a few followers. He raises a little bit of money. He for whatever reason, he determines that Harper's Ferry in Virginia, a federal arsenal, is the place to begin his uprising, right? To a place to begin inspiring slaves to rise up. You can read about the details of that all in Potter. You can check it out online. But I want to move on just a little bit beyond that because we know what happens, right? Brown is captured. It is a fiasco, right? It is a comedy of errors. His attempted slave rebellion, right? He seizes the arsenal, which is essentially unguarded. Who would ever think that somebody would come in and seize a federal arsenal? So it's essentially unguarded. He takes it over with ease, and he is then very quickly, the town realizes what's happening. The army is called in, and he's captured. Some of his followers are killed. It's interesting to note, I hope you caught on to the fact that the commanding officer that stopped or captured John Brown and his followers was Robert E. Lee. So that's very interesting, because this is the United States right now. This is not the North or the South or the Confederate States. Robert E. Lee is a soldier in the United States Army. Anyway, Brown is captured, and what happens after his capture is what we really want to pay attention to. He's jailed, and he is tried. Within a week or so, he goes on trial and found guilty. Right, without a doubt, he attempted to overthrow the federal government, basically, or he attempted to incite a rebellion in Virginia, incite a rebellion that's illegal. It's treason, if you want to call it that, or it's inciting a rebellion, getting slaves to rise up against their masters, which they were legally owned. Right, so. he's found guilty and sentenced to hang, and ultimately he does hang. But here's the interesting part, right? While he's in jail, awaiting his trial, going through his trial, and ultimately facing his execution, he writes a series of letters, he gives a series of interviews, and portrays himself as a man that was simply trying to undo an evil, right? He never really portrays that he wanted slaves to rise up and was willing to accept the death or the violence that might involve. If slaves were armed and they had to rise up against their owners, that of course is going to result in death. He doesn't ever really admit to that. He focuses more on the evils of slavery. He focuses more on him being a man that simply wanted to right a wrong. And remember, Lincoln and Douglas, they're talking, he's doing. John Brown's doing. He comports himself with dignity. And even though looking back at John Brown's checkered past, we have to wonder, about his mental state at Potawatomi and then here, because the raid on Harper's Ferry was doomed almost from the beginning. But he does it, right? And as people around the nation look and watch what's happening, they seize on John Brown as a hero, right? They're like, yes, this is a man of action. This is a man that stood up for what he believed in, and he did something about it, right? We kind of overlooked the fact what that meant, but he did it. And ultimately he is executed. As I said, he's executed in December of 1859, and people in the North, not all people, but many people in the North, look on him as his martyrdom, right? They look on him as a martyred hero. They justify what he did, right? They say, hey, slavery is evil. He did. This is a guy that was right. This is a guy that stood up and said something about this evil institution. The South, of course, they're outraged, right? They're like, what? This guy's, he committed treason, right? He tried to incite rebellion. He wanted to arm slaves who would then rise up and kill their owners and kill the families, the wives and children of their owners. This is what he stood for. And they're outraged that people in the North have turned John Brown into a hero. And the South really starts to kind of circle the wagons here. They start to feel like, hey, we are really isolated here. We are, this person that came down here to start essentially a war. John Brown came to our home and basically wanted to start a war. He wanted our slaves to kill us in our sleep. And these people are supporting him. So this is a split, right? Brown is executed in December of 1859. We're just a little over a year from the first shots of the Civil War, and we're even closer to the first states seceding from the Union, about a year away from that happening. So many people in the South feel like maybe being part of the Union is not going to work. They really feel like they've been betrayed, not portrayed. They've been betrayed by the Union, and that many people in the Union have turned their backs on the South, who would let them be victims to a zealot like John Brown. So, but remember, that's not everybody. Many people in the North are just as shocked, just as appalled that this has happened. But nonetheless, it gets it puts an emotional touch on the issue of slavery, right? This gets at people's hearts, it gets at their emotions, and it kind of, some people have said, Frederick Douglass, for one, I believe, said that John Brown started the Civil War. This is where he started the Civil War. At least the ball is definitely rolling in that direction now. All right, so there's also a video, a short video for you to watch on John Brown, and a painting that I want you to look at called Tragic Prelude. And this video, after you watch it and you look at this painting, we're going to use those in our discussion this week, but it's really important to look at the symbolism right? Look at the painting Tragic Prelude, and look at all of the symbolism in what and how John Brown is portrayed in that painting. Because the question I want you to ask, the question that has been asked, there's a lot of historical literature out there on it, especially in recent years. Is John Brown a hero, or is he a terrorist? And that's, people kind of are taken aback by that, because growing up, at least in my generation, I'm sure I'm quite a bit older than most of you in this class, John Brown really was portrayed in my elementary school social studies or history classes. He was portrayed as a hero. But now people are saying, well, maybe, just maybe, he was more of a terrorist. But interesting back and forth, I hope that we have in our discussion. All right, to wrap it up, I want to touch on Johnson here, Soul by Soul. The last couple chapters of the book, he brings up some interesting points, right? We're at the point where the sale is over, and slaves are going off to their new homes, to their new owners, to their new lives. And they have to remake their lives, right? Let's remember, part of the violence of slavery that I've said from the beginning is the constant tearing apart of your identity, right? Yes, that's not a physical violence. That's not somebody putting their hands on you and ripping apart your identity. I'm talking about just the fact that every day you are under threat of losing the home you were familiar with, your family, your spouse, your children, your extended family, your parents. In an instant, they can be torn away from you, never to be seen again. Johnson points out, well, once the sale happens, slaves begin this process of rebuilding, right? Rebuilding their identities, rebuilding the communities in which they live, and this slave culture really moves from the Upper South throughout the Deep South and West. At the same time, on the flip side of that, right, is the whites and their identities. They have gone to the slave market to make a purchase because they want to achieve a certain identity, right? They want to be recognized maybe as a slave owner. Maybe it's their first slave purchase. They want to be recognized as a smart and capable slave owner, right, and slave purchaser. But we're dealing with human beings, right? And this is the thing that I really want to stress to you, and Johnson touches on it. These are human beings. Slaves are human beings, and when the slave buyer goes into the market, he is buying a dream, right? I'm going to buy slaves to work in my fields to make me rich. I'm going to show my neighbors that I've reached a certain level of socioeconomic status, and I have house slaves that show me, or that show my neighbors that I have arrived, right? But these are people that are enslaved, and people that don't necessarily want to uphold that slave owner's view of themselves. They don't want to be part of that slave owner fantasy, right? So how do the slave owners make that happen? How do the slave owners ensure that their slaves fit the fantasy that they've created? They fit this vision in their head of what their lives are going to be like, and how the slaves are going to react and be a part of that. Well, as Johnson very accurately points out, this is so important to me, and I know it is to you as well. It's violence, right? If you own a human being that can think for themselves, and they don't want to do what you want them to do, your recourse is what? Is it? Can you ask them nicely? Sure. Did that happen? Of course it did. Some slaves, I'm sure, had a relationship, a mutually beneficial relationship with their masters, but I don't think for the most part that's the way it was. It was violence, or the threat of violence, that made slaves play the role that these slave owners wanted them to play. If they did not, if they were rude in the house, or they did not perform in the field as they were expected to, the recourse is violence. What else can the slave owner do other than threaten or inflict violent punishment to make these human beings do what they wanted them to do? So Johnson wraps it up. It's very powerful, in my opinion. This image that we have to understand that slavery in the American South is a system that is held together by violence, emotional, physical, whatever. And I want people to be sure to understand that. I still hear occasionally, well, some slaves, they had nice owners and things weren't so bad and they were clothed and they were, yeah, that's true. Of course, it's, these slaves were an investment and they were sometimes well taken care of, but not always. And at the end of the day, no matter how well you're taken care of, you have a dry place to live, you're well fed, you're well clothed, you have no freedom. And if you were to try to assert your human rights, if you got up one morning and said, I'm well fed here, I'm taken care of, I'm not overworked, I'm not worked to the point of illness or death, but I'm going to walk away, I'm going to go someplace else, what would happen? Would you be allowed to go? And if you went, how would you be brought back? Would you be asked nicely to come back, or would you be forced back at the barrel of a gun or the end of a whip? So that's an important distinction I want you to make. Finally, Johnson points out that it was the southern and westward movement of the slave market that forced the issue in the 1850s. Remember that the Upper South, the Chesapeake region, was a tobacco production region, and that has dried up. Tobacco production has depleted the soil, and those plantation owners now have a surplus of slaves that are then sold south into Alabama, Georgia, into what's becoming known as the Cotton Kingdom, and those folks are then moved west as the Cotton Kingdom expands into Mississippi, Texas, and then here we are, right? That's what brings us to this argument over these new territories, these western territories. That's why we're at this argument. And Johnson points out that it is that internal slave trade that ultimately brings the issue to a head in the West. All right, I've gone long today, and I apologize for that. So I'm going to stop it here. Discussion 5 is due this week, where we talk about the Lincoln-Douglas debates, John Brown, and Johnson's Soul by Soul. So I'm looking forward to hearing what everybody has to say in the discussions. Have a great week. Just keep in mind, it's the downhill now, especially as we come up on spring break. You have that right around the corner. And we're well into the semester, past the halfway point. So have a great week, and I'll talk to you soon.